Good morning. So today we have parable number 5. Over the last 2 weeks we have listened to a series of parables told by Jesus. The parable of the lost sheep, lost coin, and lost son that we know as prodigal son in chapter 15 of the Gospel of Luke. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week we entered chapter 16 and we heard the parable of dishonest steward. And today we again in chapter 16 and we have this parable that is known as the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Now, parables are not really true stories. They are not factual, but parables carry truth in them, divine truth. Of all the parables that Jesus told, did you know this? Of all of them, today's parable is the only parable in the Gospels in which a person has a name, Lazarus. And that is quite interesting. Of all the parables that Jesus told, only here a person has a name. We do not know the name of the prodigal son. We do not know the name of his older brother. We do not know the name of the Good Samaritan. We do not know the name of the man who went after the lost sheep. We do not know the name of the woman who was searching for the lost coin. But here Jesus says, there was a poor man named Lazarus. We do know the name of the poor man. Now, the name Lazarus means God is my help. Now, that's fascinating when you begin to think about it. And maybe Jesus gives a name to this poor man to remind all of us that the poor, the forgotten, the rejected people are not just numbers, are not just statistics, but they are real people with real names. Then and today. Now, what I find even more interesting is that the rich man is anonymous. We do not know his name. And it is quite the opposite in the world we live in. And it was, in fact, quite the opposite in the world Jesus lived in. It is often the rich, the famous, whose names are remembered, whose names are recognized, whose names are well known. The poor are anonymous. You see what Jesus is doing here? He's turning this around. He's turning this around. Now, what is it that we know about this rich man? Couple of things. Number one, he dresses in purple garments and fine linens, which means he is really, really rich, wearing royal garments. Number two, we know that he dines sumptuously every day. He has a big feast every day, not just a dinner or a supper. It's like having a Thanksgiving feast every day. Lavish meals. And then there is this man lying outside of the doors of his house, possibly a leper, hungry, and the dogs come to lick his wounds. Now notice that the dogs are attending to his wounds and doing what the rich man should be doing. And that's what a dog would do to another dog who is hurt. Lick the wounds and attend to the one that is hurt. Even the dogs are better fed. I mean, that's quite shocking. And this parable is meant to shock us into thinking. Now, I think quite often of this parable every time I drive to Worcester on Route 146, when I go every Thursday faithfully to the Polish grocery store on Millbury Street. It's called Golimo, just in case you're looking for a good Polish food. A little bit of advertisement. And you remember when you drive on 146, you get to the end and there is the bridge. And quite often, under that bridge, you will see one or two men with a sign that says, I am homeless. I need some money for food. And whenever I have some money, I try to give it to them. I probably should do it more often. And I always make sure that I ask one simple question. What is your name? What is your name? Because you want to know the name. Now, if you go to any major city and walk downtown, you eventually will run into a homeless person laying on the street. Have you ever been to New York? The homeless, are all over the place. Again, when you see them, this parable makes sense. It's clear what Jesus is talking about. It's a living example of what Jesus is talking about. You know what you are called to do. So for each of us, it's really not difficult to imagine what Jesus is talking about. Now, Luke Timothy Johnson, who wrote a wonderful commentary on the Gospel of Luke in Sacra Pagina, which is a series of commentaries, he says that this parable is a parable of rejection. He says that Lazarus stands for all the people who have been forgotten and rejected and ignored by society throughout the centuries and today. Now, and in Jesus' time, who were people who were rejected? Lepers, tax collectors, Samaritans, Gentiles, people who were mentally ill, and they are often described as possessed by unclean spirits. Women, who were people who were forgotten often, widows and orphans and the poor. So this parable is challenging us today, as it did in the first century, to recognize the forgotten and to welcome the rejected. Now there's a beautiful story, and let me finish with this story, about St. Francis of Assisi. Now, the city of Assisi in Italy is built on the side of a mountain, as it is often the case in Italy and the cities of the Middle Ages. And the richer you were, the higher up you lived. Below, outside of the city walls, lived who? The lepers, the outcasts, the poor, who could only look up to the city from down below, and they were not able to enter. Now, Francis of Assisi was a rich and a little bit spoiled son of a well-known dealer of fine linens in Assisi, and his name was Pietro di Bernardone. Now, everybody in Assisi knew who Pietro di Bernardone was and who his son was. Francis enjoyed the beautiful views of the landscapes from his house. He enjoyed nature and would often ride his horse, enjoying his father's estates. And the story goes that one day he encountered a leper on the road. Francis was ready to flee in disgust, but something held him. Something held him. Maybe it was the leper's eyes, which longed for human relationship, for acceptance and love, and not rejection and disgust. And what Francis did next changed the course of his life. He dismounted, he embraced the leper, he gave him some money for food, and he wished him, Christ, peace. Today's parable and the story of St. Francis invites us to ask a simple question. Who is Lazarus today in our society? Where is Lazarus today? And to give a name to Lazarus, to give a name to those who feel rejected and forgotten. But even more importantly, today's parable challenges us to be Lazarus. And what I mean by this is this. Remember, the name Lazarus means God is my help. This parable invites us to be instruments of God's help in this world, to embrace, to welcome, and to help.